The October wind blew yellow leaves across the sidewalk as Melody Trentwood climbed the steps of the music school. She held a worn case containing the violin she had inherited from her mother. The heavy oak door creaked as she entered the warm hall, filled with the sounds of pianos and cellos coming from the classrooms. She had been working here for 6 years. Crescendo Private School was located in an old mansion with high ceilings and stained glass windows. The director, Eugene Brightman, had turned the family home into a temple of music where children from wealthy families studied. Climbing to the second floor, Melody unlocked the door to her classroom. Sunlight flooded the room through the tall windows, dancing on the polished surface of the grand piano. Portraits of great composers and photographs of school graduates hung on the walls. Among them was Melody herself, a thin girl with a violin photographed 15 years ago. She remembered how her mother had sold her engagement ring to pay for her first year of lessons. "Music is more important than gold," she said at the time. 3 years later, her mother died of cancer, leaving her daughter with only her violin and her passion for music. Melody moved in with her Aunt Agatha, who owned an antique shop and insisted that she continue her lessons. As she was laying out the sheet music for her first lesson, Melody heard the sound of a car pulling up. Through the window, she saw a black Mercedes pull up, and a tall woman in a strict suit got out, holding the hand of a girl with red braids. Marcus Ravenscroft insisted on meeting the teacher in person before his daughter started lessons. His assistant had called the day before to say they would arrive at 9. Melody knew who he was, the owner of several restaurants and the Azure Peacock, a popular meeting place for the city's elite. Abigail Ravenscroft turned out to be a shy girl with serious green eyes. She clutched her new violin case tightly to her chest while her father's assistant, Veronica Page, filled out the paperwork. "She has perfect pitch," Veronica said. "Mr. Ravenscroft wants you to give her private lessons 3 times a week. Money is no object." When Melody asked Abigail to play something, the girl chose Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Her technique needed work, but there was soul in her playing. That evening, Aunt Agatha invited Melody to dinner. At 72, she was still an energetic woman with a sharp mind. Her antique shop was thriving, and her apartment was like a museum, filled with antique furniture, paintings, and porcelain. "I'm proud of you," Agatha said, pouring tea into Sèvres cups. "You've built a life for yourself despite everything. Your mother would be happy." Melody looked at the portrait of her mother on the wall, a young woman with a violin, so much like herself. Agatha followed her gaze. "You know, I keep thinking about traveling to Europe. I want to visit antique auctions in Paris and Vienna. Dr. Samuels says my heart might not be able to take it, but what's the point of taking care of myself at my age?" Melody knew there was no point in arguing. Her aunt always did things her own way. Like her mother, she believed that life should be lived to the fullest. The next day, regular lessons with Abigail began. The girl turned out to be a diligent student, quick to grasp everything. She rarely smiled, but when she did, her face seemed to light up from within. Gradually, Abigail began to open up. She talked about her life, how rarely she saw her perpetually busy father, about the private school she attended, about her favorite books. Melody listened, realizing that the girl lacked simple human warmth. Time flew by unnoticed. Winter was approaching and the days were getting shorter. Melody stayed late at school more and more often, preparing for the Christmas concert. In the evenings, she visited her Aunt Agatha, who was enthusiastically planning her European tour despite her frequent bouts of arrhythmia. The Crescendo School's charity concert was traditionally held in mid-December. The city concert hall was decorated with fir garlands and silver ribbons, and a decorated Christmas tree was set up in the foyer. Melody watched the hustle and bustle from behind the scenes, helping the students tune their instruments. Abigail was scheduled to perform in the first part. She stood in front of the mirror in a long, dark blue dress, running her fingers over the strings of her violin. Her red hair was styled in an elegant bun. Veronica, who looked after the girl at all events in place of her perpetually busy father, had done her best. By the start of the concert, the hall was completely full. Among the audience were wealthy parents of students, representatives of the city's elite, and school sponsors. Melody noticed her Aunt Agatha in the front row, dressed in her favorite burgundy suit. When Abigail came on stage, the hall fell silent. She played Bach's Chaconne, a difficult piece for a young violinist, but the girl performed brilliantly. Her music flew through the hall, making the audience hold their breath. After the performance, Abigail Melody descended into the hall. During the intermission, the foyer filled with the hum of voices and the clinking of champagne glasses. She congratulated other students and exchanged pleasantries with parents when someone touched her elbow. Preston Fairchild looked like a man accustomed to making an impression. He wore an impeccable suit, had a confident smile, and attentive brown eyes. He introduced himself as the owner of a chain of car dealerships and a member of the Philharmonic's Board of Trustees. "Your student is magnificent," he said, referring to Abigail. "I haven't heard Bach played like that in a long time. You have an amazing gift for bringing out talent." They talked throughout the intermission. Preston turned out to be an interesting conversationalist. He knew classical music, traveled extensively, and was a good listener. When the second half began, he asked Melody for her phone number. Their first date was 3 days later at an Italian restaurant overlooking the river. Preston talked about his business, his plans to expand his chain of salons, and his passion for mountain skiing. Melody talked about music, her students, and her dream of opening her own school. Over dinner, she learned that he had grown up in a poor family, built his business from scratch, and gone through a difficult divorce 5 years earlier. "My ex-wife was obsessed with money," he explained. "I was looking for emotional intimacy in marriage, and she wanted status and wealth." Preston knew how to create an atmosphere of trust and warmth. He was easygoing and interesting. He called every day, sent flowers to the school, and invited her to the theater and concerts. When a symphony orchestra was in town, they listened to Vivaldi's Four Seasons from the best seats. Aunt Agatha, who met Preston at Sunday lunch, was pleased. "He has class," she told her niece, "and most importantly, he appreciates music and understands your calling." The only discord in this idyll was Abigail's wary attitude. When Preston once came to see Melody after class, the girl became withdrawn and answered in monosyllables. "She's just jealous," Melody decided. Children often react that way to changes in the life of a beloved teacher. Their romance developed rapidly. Preston won her over with his sincerity and care. He would bring her medicine in the middle of the night when Melody had a cold. He organized a trip to the Philharmonic for her class. He helped Aunt Agatha with heavy boxes of antiques. In the spring, they often walked along the embankment. Preston talked about the future, about a house in the country, about traveling together, about children who would definitely be musically gifted. Melody listened and thought that she had finally met the man she wanted to share her life with. He proposed on the anniversary of their meeting during a school charity concert. He got down on one knee right on the stage, where the last chords had just faded away. The audience applauded. Melody cried with happiness, and Preston slipped a diamond ring on her finger. At the engagement party, Aunt Agatha raised a toast to the couple. "Take care of each other," she said. "Life is unpredictable, but true love helps overcome any challenge." Preston kissed his future aunt's hand and promised to make her niece the happiest woman in the world. That evening, they sat for a long time in their favorite restaurant, making plans for the future. Soft spring snow fell outside the window, champagne sparkled in their glasses, and Melody felt that she had finally found happiness. The spring sun flooded the classroom as Abigail rehearsed a new piece. Her fingers glided confidently across the violin neck, producing clear, ringing notes. Melody watched her student, noting how her technique had changed over the past few months. There was a knock at the door. It was Preston with a bouquet of lilies of the valley. "Keep going, I'll wait," he whispered, settling into a chair by the window. Abigail frowned and lost her place. Her shoulders tensed and the bow began to scratch the strings. Melody gently stopped the girl. "Let's take a break. You've done a great job today." While Abigail put her violin away, Preston talked about his plans to expand his business. He was going to open a new car dealership in the city's business district. Abigail pointedly ignored him, concentrating on cleaning her bow. "Goodbye, Miss Trentwood," she muttered as she headed for the door. Veronica was waiting for her in the hallway with a tablet in her hands. "She's still not used to me," Preston sighed when they were alone. "Maybe we should give her tickets to a symphony concert." Melody shook her head. "Abigail doesn't like gifts. She needs time." They drove off to choose wallpaper for their future home. Preston had bought a mansion in the suburbs, an old one with columns and stained glass windows. It needed renovating, and Melody spent her evenings leafing through catalogs of finishing materials. Preston insisted on a classic style: beige tones, heavy curtains, antique furniture. One of the rooms was planned as a music room. Preston ordered a grand piano from Germany and a sound system. "You can give private lessons here," he said. "Only for select students, of course. The wife of a car dealership owner shouldn't work in a regular school." Melody ignored these words, absorbed in choosing light fixtures. Aunt Agatha, looking around the house, called it worthy of a family nest. She brought antique candlesticks and a tapestry with a pastoral scene as gifts. Abigail made progress in her lessons. Her playing became more emotional and technical. She was preparing for a summer competition for young performers. Every morning before school, the girl came to extra lessons. "My father says that music is not a serious occupation," she confessed once while tuning her violin. "He wants me to study economics and prepare to run his business." Melody chose her words carefully. "What do you want?" Abigail shrugged and began to play. Her music spoke louder than words. It expressed a longing to be understood, a desire to be heard. That evening, Preston took Melody to look at wedding dresses. A consultant greeted them in the salon with a selection of dresses. Preston confidently rejected one style after another until he stopped at a classic dress with a lace train. "It will be perfect for the church," he declared. Melody looked at herself in the mirror, feeling strangely uncertain. The dress seemed too fluffy and heavy, but Preston insisted and she agreed. At home, Aunt Agatha was waiting with news. The doctors had found a heart problem. "It's nothing serious," she dismissed. "Just a slight arrhythmia. I'll get better and go on my trip." Preston offered to find the best cardiologists. He spent hours on the phone arranging consultations. Agatha thanked him, but there was a look of concern in her eyes. She asked her niece more and more often if she was sure about her choice. Abigail continued to rehearse with redoubled energy. Her playing became more mature and confident. At rehearsals for the competition program, even Veronica put down her tablet, mesmerized by the music. Preston was busy preparing for the wedding. He personally met with florists, compiled a guest list, and chose the menu. Every detail had to match his vision of the perfect celebration. "You're not helping with the preparations at all," he reproached Melody one day. "This is our special day." "I trust your taste," she replied, looking through her sheet music for her lessons. "Besides, I have a lot of work with my students right now." Preston frowned but said nothing. He increasingly brought up the subject of Melody quitting her job at the school after the wedding. "You'll need to take care of the house and social obligations. It's a different level of life." At times like these, Melody felt a vague uneasiness, but she chalked it up to pre-wedding jitters. She immersed herself in her work, preparing Abigail for the competition and helping Aunt Agatha with her medication. It seemed that life had finally found a clear direction. The morning of the wedding was cloudy. Candles burned in the old church, reflecting off the stained glass windows. The heavy lace dress restricted her movements, and Melody struggled to climb the steps. Aunt Agatha walked beside her, supporting her niece by the elbow. The entire town's high society had gathered in the church. Preston's business partners, members of the country club, representatives of the city administration. Melody recognized the faces of her students' parents. In the front row sat Abigail in a light blue bridesmaid's dress. Next to her was the ever-present Veronica with her tablet. Preston waited at the altar, impeccable in his tuxedo, confident in every gesture. The ceremony proceeded according to a pre-approved script. The priest said the right words, the guests smiled at the right moments, and the photographer snapped away from carefully calculated angles. At the wedding reception in a country club, Preston stayed close to a group of businessmen, discussing some important deal. Melody sat at the head table, mechanically responding to congratulations. She noticed Abigail slip quietly into the garden, grabbing her violin case. Vivaldi played in the garden. Melody found the girl by the fountain, playing with her eyes closed, as if shielding herself from the festive bustle. The music was filled with a poignant sadness. "I'm sorry. I should have come to rehearsal yesterday," Melody said, sitting down next to her. Abigail put down her violin. "It's okay. I understand. You have a wedding." Her voice sounded as sad as the music. Melody wanted to say something, but Preston interrupted them. He was annoyed. "Honey, the guests are asking for you. It's not nice to hide at your own wedding." After their honeymoon in the Maldives, they moved into a renovated mansion. Preston insisted that Melody reduce the number of her students to only children from influential families, with private lessons in their home salon. Abigail remained the only student from the music school. Preston increasingly stayed late at the office. When he returned, he smelled of expensive whiskey. He scrutinized the house, noting every speck of dust, every little thing out of place. "You don't keep the place tidy," he said with cold disapproval. "We have important guests coming." Melody tried to explain that she was busy with her students all day, but Preston interrupted. "Maybe you should quit teaching altogether. The wife of a successful man should take care of the home and social life." Aunt Agatha, who visited them on Sundays, frowned more and more as she watched her son-in-law. One day, she stayed after dinner waiting for Preston to leave on business. "He's changed," she said, looking at her niece. "Or has he just stopped pretending?" Melody shook her head. "He just works a lot. The new salon needs attention." Agatha said nothing, but her gaze spoke volumes. She and Abigail continued their lessons 3 times a week. The girl was preparing for an important competition, and music had become her way of expressing everything she couldn't put into words. Even simple scales sounded like a confession when she played them. Preston became increasingly concerned about Aunt Agatha's health. Every time she came over, he bombarded her with questions about how she was feeling, what medication she was taking, and her plans for the future. He was particularly interested in her travels. "You shouldn't risk your health for some antique shops," he said with feigned concern. "At your age, you need to rest more." Agatha responded with barbs, and these Sunday dinners increasingly resembled a duel with swords. Melody rushed between her husband and aunt, trying to smooth over the growing tension. In the evenings, she played the piano for hours in the empty music room. Music was the only way she could forget how rapidly her life was changing. Sometimes it seemed to her that the huge house with its columns was turning into a beautiful cage where her every step was monitored and her every word was judged. Preston talked more and more about status, about how the wife of a successful man should look and behave. He bought her expensive jewelry and demanded that she wear it even at home. He scheduled her day down to the minute: charity dinners, meetings with his partner's wives, social gatherings. "You have to learn to fit in," he repeated. "This is no longer your old life as a music teacher." Autumn painted the garden in golden hues. Melody sat by the window of the music room, watching the gardener rake up the fallen leaves. Next to her, Abigail worked on a difficult passage from a Mendelssohn concerto. Her red hair glowed in the rays of the setting sun. On the table lay an invitation to a charity evening at the Azure Peacock. Preston insisted that Melody attend. Important business partners were expected to be there. Lately, all their conversations had been about status, connections, and the right acquaintances. Abigail finished playing and put down her violin. Her face showed signs of fatigue. The girl was preparing for an audition at the conservatory. Her father had reluctantly agreed, but on one condition: if she didn't get in, she would have to go to London to study economics. "I'm scared," Abigail admitted, sitting down next to Melody. "What if I don't make it?" Melody wanted to answer, but they were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up. Preston had returned earlier than usual. Abigail hurriedly began gathering her sheet music, trying not to cross paths with the owner of the house. Preston entered the living room smelling of expensive cologne. A strange smile played on his face. "I ran into Aunt Agatha in town today," he said, settling into a chair. "She didn't look well. Did you know she was planning to sell the shop?" Melody shook her head in surprise. Her aunt hadn't mentioned anything about selling. "She's getting forgetful," Preston continued. "She's getting on in years. Maybe we should think about guardianship. After all, she's got a fortune. It would be a shame if it went to some crooks." His voice sounded falsely concerned. Melody said nothing, feeling a chill run down her spine. That evening, she called her aunt. Agatha had no intention of selling the shop. On the contrary, she was planning to expand the business. She had been offered a lucrative deal at an auction in Vienna. "Your husband was very interested in my will," Agatha said. "I told him I was going to spend it all on travel. You should have seen his face." At the charity evening at the Azure Peacock, Preston was dazzling. He moved from group to group, charming the guests with his impeccable manners. Melody stood nearby, smiling and making small talk. Her new dress from a famous designer cost a fortune. "Darling, tell Mrs. Henderson about your music lessons," Preston asked with a barely perceptible sneer. "Such a lovely hobby for a businessman's wife." Melody swallowed her hurt. He used to be proud of her teaching, but now he constantly hinted that the job was beneath their status. At home, he gave the maid another dressing down for a stain on the tablecloth. His irritability grew with each passing day. He was particularly annoyed by talk of Aunt Agatha's health. "She's perfectly fine," he declared, throwing the newspaper on the table. "That old fox is leading everyone by the nose. I bet she's already spent half her fortune on her travels." Melody silently gathered her sheet music for tomorrow's lesson. She had learned not to argue with her husband. It only made him angrier. On the weekend, they hosted a reception for Preston's business partners. The guests admired the interior, the antique furniture, and the art collection. Melody played the piano. This was always the highlight of the evening. "My wife is a real talent," Preston would say. "It's a shame she wastes her time teaching. With her talent, she could be performing in the best concert halls." His words sounded like a compliment, but Melody heard a threat in them. Preston was methodically trying to tear her away from everything that connected her to her former life. Aunt Agatha came to lunch wearing a new suit and carrying a pile of documents about her health. "Here are all the doctor's reports," she said, laying the papers in front of Preston. "I'm perfectly healthy. I'm going on a trip around the world." Preston turned white with anger. He spent the entire evening in his study, typing furiously on his laptop. When Melody peeked in, He slammed the lid shut so hard that she feared for the hinges. Abigail arrived in the morning. She brought new sheet music. She was going to learn a difficult piece for an audition. They practiced until lunchtime while Preston was at the office. "My father says music isn't serious," the girl said during a break. "What should I think about my future?" Melody looked at her student, recognizing herself in her. The same passion for music, the same lack of understanding from those close to her. In the evening, Aunt Agatha called. She was going to Vienna for an auction. Preston, overhearing the conversation, locked himself in his study again. Muffled voices could be heard from inside. He was arguing with someone on the phone. In her bedroom, Melody took an old photograph of her mother with a violin out of a box. I wonder what she would say if she could see her daughter's life now. Preston insisted that the photograph not be hung in the house. It doesn't fit in with the decor. That night she dreamed of music school, lessons with Abigail, and student concerts. She woke up to the sound of the front door slamming. Preston had left again before dawn. On the table was a list of social events she was supposed to attend that week. Her life was turning into an endless series of receptions, charity evenings, and empty conversations. The last leaves were falling in the garden. The gardener raked them into neat piles, but the wind blew them back onto the paths. Melody looked out the window and thought about how her life had changed over the past year. Everything around her seemed beautiful, expensive, and completely foreign. Correcting mistakes. Concept. Melody Trentwood is a violin teacher, and among her students is 13-year-old Abigail, the daughter of Marcus Ravenscroft, owner of the elite club Azure Peacock. Abigail has been a private student from the very beginning. The house smelled of cinnamon and vanilla. The cook was baking a pie for the guests. Melody sat in the music room sorting through the sheet music for her upcoming lesson with Abigail. Wet snow was falling outside, turning the driveway into a mess. Preston had been grumbling since morning at the gardener, who was behind schedule clearing the paths. Abigail arrived right on time, driven by the Ravenscroft chauffeur in a black Mercedes. The girl looked unusually pale. As she took her violin out of its case, Melody noticed her fingers trembling slightly. "My father threw a party yesterday," Abigail said quietly as she tuned her instrument. "He made me play in front of the guests. I made a mistake in a simple passage." She fell silent, but Melody understood without being told. Marcus Ravenscroft did not forgive mistakes, not even from his own daughter, especially not from his own daughter. They immersed themselves in their work. Music always helped Abigail forget about her troubles at home. Her violin sang, cried, soared to the ceiling, and fell again, scattering crystal notes. Melody listened, holding her breath. The girl played with a feeling that was rare even among adult musicians. The front door slammed. Preston was back. His footsteps echoed in the hallway, approaching the music room. Abigail lost her rhythm, but Melody gestured for her to continue. Preston froze in the doorway, leaning against the doorframe. He smelled of expensive whiskey, even though it was only 3 in the afternoon. He glanced pointedly at his watch. "How much longer is this going to go on? We have important guests today." Abigail put down her violin. Her face froze, becoming like a porcelain mask. Melody stood up, feeling anger boiling inside her. "We're having a lesson. We'll be done in half an hour." Preston grunted and left, slamming the door loudly. Abigail hurriedly put away her violin. "There's no need to rush," Melody said softly. "Let's finish the piece." But the moment was hopelessly ruined. Abigail's fingers trembled and the bow scratched the strings. When her chauffeur arrived, she rushed out of the house without even saying goodbye. In the evening, guests arrived, Preston's business partners and their wives. Melody sat at the head of the table making small talk. She had learned to smile and nod in the right places, not listening to the empty chatter about new cars, resorts, and trendy restaurants. Preston was in his element, talking about his plans to expand the business. His new car dealership was due to open in a month. Melody noticed him swaying slightly as he poured himself another glass of whiskey. After dinner, the wives looked around the house, admiring the antique furniture and the art collection. Preston casually mentioned that he was expecting several more valuable items from European auctions. "My wife is very knowledgeable about art," he said, putting his arm around Melody's shoulders. His fingers dug painfully into her skin. "She's a real aristocrat." The guests left after midnight. Preston staggered upstairs to his bedroom. Melody remained in the music room, where she often spent sleepless nights poring over sheet music and reminiscing about her days as a school teacher. In the morning, Aunt Agatha called to say she was leaving on another trip. Preston, hearing her voice from the next room, slammed his laptop shut and left the house without even eating breakfast. He returned late in the evening, smelling of whiskey again. Melody was sitting in the parlor preparing for tomorrow's lesson. Preston stood in the doorway swaying. "Are you still fiddling with your papers? The wife of a successful man should be enjoying high society, not some lessons." Melody said nothing, continuing to make notes in her music book. Preston came closer. "I spoke to Ravenscroft. His daughter can find another teacher, someone more prestigious." She looked up. "Abigail is my student, and I'm not going to abandon her." "You're my wife," Preston barked, "and you'll do what I say." His shout echoed through the empty house. Somewhere upstairs, the maid gasped in fright. Melody sat motionless, clutching her pencil with white knuckles. That morning, Preston had smelled of expensive cologne mixed with the stench of a hangover. He drank his coffee in silence and left for the office. On the table was an envelope with an invitation to a charity event at the Azure Peacock. Abigail arrived at her lesson pale and distraught. She spent a long time tuning her violin, not daring to look up. "My father says he wants to find me another teacher," she finally said. "But I don't want another one. You're the only one who understands." Melody hugged the girl around the shoulders. "Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere." They practiced until dark. The music floated over the quiet garden, over the snow-covered roofs, over the city sinking into the winter twilight. In those sounds was the freedom that both of them so desperately lacked in their lives. Spring came suddenly, overnight. Melody woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside the window. The first crocuses were blooming in the garden. Preston was already gone. Only a crumpled pillow and the faint smell of whiskey reminded her of his presence. In the mailbox was a letter from Aunt Agatha, sent from Vienna. It was an old-fashioned envelope with stamps. Inside were photos of antique shops and endless stories about treasures she had found. Her aunt wrote that she was feeling wonderful. The doctors at the Austrian clinic had found no problems with her heart. Melody was rereading the letter in the music room when Preston appeared. He glanced over her shoulder and his face contorted. "Having fun again? She should think about the future instead of throwing money down the drain." Lately, he had made no secret of his irritation at any mention of Aunt Agatha. He was particularly annoyed by talk of her travels and spending. Every Sunday, when her aunt came over for lunch, Preston would interrogate her about her health and finances. The doorbell interrupted his latest tirade. Abigail had arrived for her lesson. The girl had matured over the past few months. Her movements had become more graceful and her playing had gained a special depth. She was preparing for a serious competition, rehearsing a difficult program. Preston demonstratively shut himself in his study, but even through two doors she could hear him arguing with someone on the phone. Abigail tried to play more quietly, but the music still reached the study. After a particularly loud passage, Preston threw open the door. "Can you stop that noise? I have an important meeting." Abigail flinched, her bow scratching the strings. Melody looked calmly at her husband. "We're practicing. If it bothers you, you can go to another wing of the house." Preston turned red but restrained himself. After all, Marcus Ravenscroft's daughter was not someone to be yelled at. He silently slammed the office door shut. In the evening, a message arrived from Aunt Agatha. She was returning from Vienna with a suitcase full of antique finds. Preston read the message over Melody's shoulder and launched into a bitter tirade about old women who didn't think about their heirs. On Sunday, his aunt arrived looking refreshed and rejuvenated, wearing a new suit from a Viennese boutique. She brought souvenirs and endless stories about her European adventures. Preston sat at the head of the table, growing gloomier with every glass of wine. "How is your health, dear Agatha?" he finally asked with feigned concern. His aunt smiled and took a folder out of her bag. "Fine. Here are all the test results from the clinic in Vienna. No heart problems. The doctors say I have at least another 20 years to live." The glass in Preston's hand trembled, and wine splashed onto the tablecloth. He abruptly rose from the table and locked himself in his study. All night long, muffled voices could be heard coming from the room. He was arguing with someone on the phone. In the morning, he smelled not only of a hangover, but also of some unfamiliar perfume. Melody pretended not to notice the lipstick marks on his shirt collar. Lately, she had been pretending not to notice the obvious more and more often. Abigail brought new sheet music to class, a difficult piece for a competition. Her playing was becoming more confident and technical, but most importantly, it had acquired that special depth that distinguishes a true musician. "My father said that if I win the competition, I can continue my music lessons," she shared during the break. "And if not," Melody understood what was behind that "if not." Marcus Ravenscroft did not forgive defeat. In the evening, Aunt Agatha called. She was going on another trip, this time to Italy. Preston, overhearing the conversation, threw the papers on the floor in anger. "When will that old witch settle down? All she does is send money." "It's her money," Melody said quietly. "She can do what she wants with it." "You say that because it's not your inheritance," Preston snapped. "And we could—" He stopped himself, but it was too late. The words had already slipped out. Melody looked at her husband as if she were seeing him for the first time. There was such greed in his eyes that she became frightened. She lay awake late into the night, listening to her husband's breathing. Preston tossed and turned, muttering something in his sleep. A couple of times she heard Aunt Agatha's name and some numbers. In the morning, he left before dawn. He left his phone on the table, which vibrated continuously with incoming messages. Melody didn't bother to read them. She already knew enough about her husband's double life. The first tulips were blooming in the garden. The gardener was pruning the rose bushes, preparing them for the new season. Melody looked out the window and thought about how strange life was. Everything around her was coming to life and blooming, while her own world seemed to be covered in frost. Aunt Agatha showed up unannounced, simply ringing the doorbell early in the morning. She was beaming, waving envelopes with tickets. A round-the-world trip she had dreamed of her whole life. A cruise ship, exotic countries, 6 months away from home. Melody made tea in her aunt's favorite set, an antique one with blue flowers. They sat in the morning room, the sun flooding the room with warm light, and her aunt talked about the upcoming trip, leafing through glossy brochures. Preston appeared silently and froze in the doorway. He smelled of yesterday's whiskey. His tie was askew and there were dark circles under his eyes. It looked like he hadn't slept a wink. "Agatha, my dear," his voice was honeyed. "How are you feeling? Are you sure such a long trip?" Her aunt waved her hand, pulling another stack of medical reports out of her bag. "I'm perfectly healthy. The Swiss doctors say I have the heart of a young woman." Preston turned pale. His fingers clenched the back of the chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "And what about your inheritance?" he hissed through clenched teeth. Agatha raised her eyebrows in surprise. "What inheritance, dear?" I'm going to spend all the money on traveling. I've always dreamed of seeing the world, and now I can finally afford it." A ringing silence hung in the room. Melody saw the veins in her husband's temples throbbing, his hands beginning to tremble slightly. "Did you know?" He turned to his wife. "Did you know there was no inheritance?" Melody stared silently into her cup of cooling tea. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Aunt Agatha slowly straighten up in her chair. "Get out!" Preston yelled, knocking the tea set off the table. The porcelain shattered into pieces. "Get out of my house, you liar, you swindler!" "Preston," Melody said quietly, "you're drunk. Let's talk later." "Talk?" He laughed, and there was madness in his laughter. "What is there to talk about? I spent 3 years waiting for this inheritance. 3 years putting up with your lessons, your music, your aunt. So you married me for the inheritance," Melody replied just as quietly. "How could I have thought otherwise?" The slap burned her face. Aunt Agatha jumped up, but Preston was already dragging Melody to the door. "Get out, and take your things with you." He threw her onto the porch, followed by her violin case. The door slammed and the lock clicked. Aunt Agatha hugged her niece around the shoulders while she gathered the scattered sheet music. Her hands were shaking, and a wet spot spread across one page. Melody didn't notice the tears rolling down her cheeks. "Let's go to my place," said her aunt. "The taxi is already on its way." Melody shook her head. "I have a lesson with Abigail in an hour. I have to let her know." She took out her phone and dialed Veronica's number, Ravenscroft's assistant. She apologized and explained that she would have to cancel the lesson. Her voice sounded calm, but her fingers were still trembling. The sun was rising above the rooftops as the taxi drove them away from the mansion with its columns. Melody looked out the window at the streets passing by and thought that for the first time in a long time, she could breathe freely. The phone rang as they pulled up to her aunt's house. It was Marcus Ravenscroft. Melody stared at the screen for a few seconds before answering. "Miss Trentwood," Ravenscroft's voice sounded dry and formal. "Veronica has informed me that the lesson has been canceled. Abigail is upset. I would like to know why." Melody was silent, searching for words. How could she explain to this man that she had been kicked out of her home like a stray cat, that her husband was an inheritance hunter? "Miss Trentwood?" Ravenscroft's voice took on a steely tone. "I'm waiting for an explanation," and she told him. Briefly, dryly, without emotion. About the wedding, the inheritance, this morning. Ravenscroft listened silently. When she finished, there was silence on the line. "You know, Miss Trentwood, I don't like it when someone upsets my daughter, and I really don't like marriage swindlers." He paused for a second and added, "Abigail's lesson will take place as usual. My driver will pick you up." There were a few short beeps on the line. Melody looked at Aunt Agatha, who was smiling a strange, slightly predatory smile. "I think," said her aunt, "it's going to be a very interesting evening at the Azure Peacock." Marcus Ravenscroft sat in his office on the second floor of the Azure Peacock, reviewing surveillance footage. Preston Fairchild had arrived at the club around noon and headed straight for the bar. He was now sitting at a table in the back of the room, engaged in conversation with an elderly lady wearing a pearl necklace. Security reported that she was Eleanor Hartley, the widow of a banker who had inherited a considerable fortune. She had recently moved to town and bought a mansion on Park Avenue. Marcus took a sip of whiskey and closed his eyes. He couldn't get his morning conversation with Melody Trentwood out of his head. He was used to forming opinions about people, and this woman commanded respect. No tearful excuses, no hysterics, just restrained dignity in her voice. His daughter loved those music lessons. Abigail rarely showed any emotion, a flaw in her upbringing perhaps, or his own mistakes as a father. But when she talked about her lessons with Miss Trentwood, her eyes would light up. Marcus glanced back at the monitor. Preston was talking animatedly to the widow, gesturing dramatically with his hands. His jacket hung carelessly over the back of the chair, his tie askew. With an animal instinct honed by years in business, Marcus sensed insincerity in his every gesture. There was a knock at the door and Veronica entered with a folder of documents. His indispensable assistant had already gathered information about Fairchild's financial situation. An interesting picture was emerging. Huge debts, mortgaged car dealerships, loans at extortionate interest rates. "Call the bank manager," Marcus said, looking through the papers. "I think they'll be interested in the real state of affairs of one of their major borrowers." Veronica nodded and left silently. On the monitor screen, Preston moved closer to the widow, whispering something fervently in her ear. The woman blushed like a schoolgirl, adjusting her pearl necklace. Marcus frowned. He didn't like to interfere in other people's affairs, but this was his daughter's teacher. The woman who, for the first time in a long time, had been able to get through to Abigail. By evening, the club was crowded. Preston moved with the widow to the VIP area and ordered expensive champagne. He was already holding her hand, stroking her ring-covered fingers. Marcus went down to the hall, nodding to acquaintances. His presence always caused a slight stir among the visitors. His reputation as someone best not to mess with worked flawlessly. He slowly walked past Preston's table, noticing how he flinched and pulled his hand away from the widow. I wonder if Fairchild knows that his wife teaches the club owner's daughter. Judging by the fear that flashed in his eyes, he does. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a message from the bank. They were ready to begin an unscheduled audit of the borrower's financial status. Marcus smiled. The wheel was turning. Veronica reported that the driver had brought Miss Trentwood to her lesson with Abigail. The girl was happy. She was preparing for an important audition and couldn't miss her lesson. Preston, meanwhile, was openly flirting with the widow. His tie had slipped completely to one side, and his eyes were shining feverishly. He kept glancing at Marcus, but Marcus pretended to be completely absorbed in conversation with his business partners. When the clock struck midnight, the widow got ready to go home. Preston offered to walk her out, but something in Marcus's expression made him change his mind. He said an awkward goodbye and headed for the exit, staggering slightly. Marcus watched him go, absent-mindedly twirling a glass of whiskey in his fingers. Tomorrow the bank would begin its audit, which meant that very soon there would be one less marriage swindler in town. But for now, let Fairchild think his plan would work. Let him continue to ogle rich widows. After all, Marcus Ravenscroft knew how to wait, and he knew how to punish those who deserved it. Gravel crunched under the wheels of the car as it pulled up to the driveway of the Ravenscroft mansion. Melody sat in the back seat, clutching her violin case to her chest, the only thing she had managed to grab from Preston's house. The driver, a silent man in a strict suit, parked the car at the front entrance. The Ravenscroft house was striking in its elegant restraint. No ostentatious luxury, just impeccable taste in every detail. Veronica met Melody in the hall and led her to the music room where Abigail was already waiting. The girl looked unusually excited. They practiced longer than usual. Abigail played with a kind of desperate passion, as if trying to express through music everything she couldn't say with words. When she lowered her bow, a ringing silence hung in the room. "Father wants to talk to you," Abigail finally said. "He's waiting in his study." Marcus Ravenscroft's study was on the second floor. Heavy curtains, mahogany bookcases, a massive desk. Everything exuded the calm confidence of a man accustomed to making decisions. Marcus stood at the window, looking out at the garden, where the gardener was pruning the rose bushes. He turned at the sound of footsteps and gestured for Melody to sit down in a leather armchair. "I've made some inquiries about your husband," he began without preamble, "or rather, your soon-to-be ex-husband. An interesting picture is emerging. debts, document fraud, several failed marriages in other cities. Melody was silent, staring at her hands. Marcus walked over to the table and took out some papers. There is a guest wing in the house. 3 rooms, a separate entrance, a small garden. It would be convenient for you to give lessons there. She looked up, not quite understanding. Are you offering me? I'm offering you a place to live and work, Marcus interrupted. Abigail needs regular lessons, and you need somewhere to live until your divorce is finalized. There was not a hint of condescension or pity in his voice, only the businesslike tone of a man offering a mutually beneficial solution. I can't accept, Melody began, but Marcus interrupted her again. You can and you will. Consider it part of the payment for Abigail's education. Veronica will show you the house and help you with the formalities. He returned to the window, indicating that the conversation was over. When Melody was already at the door, his voice caught up with her. And one more thing. I saw your husband at the club today. He was actively courting a wealthy widow. I think he's going to have serious problems with the bank that financed his business. Melody turned around, but Marcus continued to stare out the window. Only the muscles in his jaw betrayed his tension. The guest wing turned out to be a charming little house in the depths of the garden. Bright rooms, antique furniture, a grand piano in the living room. The windows overlooked the rose garden. Veronica busily explained the rules of residence, the staff schedule, and the security system. Mr. Ravenscroft asked me to tell you that you can have other students here, she said, handing him a set of keys. But only if you give me a list in advance. By evening, Melody's belongings had been brought from Preston's house. Clothes, sheet music, personal items. Marcus had apparently sent someone to pick them up. Preston didn't even try to stop him. Perhaps he wasn't home, or perhaps the name Ravenscroft had the desired effect. Abigail came running as soon as she heard about the move. She wandered around the rooms, making plans for the furniture, talking about the garden and the gardener who grew amazing roses. For the first time in a long time, her eyes shone with genuine joy. In the evening, the maid knocked on the door, bringing dinner on a silver tray. Melody sat by the window, watching the garden lights come on. Somewhere deep inside the house, a violin was playing. Abigail was practicing before bed. Aunt Agatha, upon hearing about the move, merely grunted. Marcus Ravenscroft is a man with connections and principles. Preston should start worrying. Melody said nothing. She thought about the strangeness of fate, how a series of events that had begun so painfully had brought her to this quiet garden, where even the air seemed to be filled with music. The Azure Peacock was bustling with excitement, a reception to celebrate an engagement. Eleanor Hartley, a banker's widow, was celebrating her upcoming marriage. Preston Fairchild beamed as he accepted congratulations. His new suit from a famous tailor emphasized his success and respectability. Marcus Ravenscroft watched the proceedings from his office. A spectacle unfolded on the surveillance monitors. Preston was charming the guests, staying close to the bride and kissing her hand dramatically. The entire city's high society had gathered in the hall. Champagne glasses clinked. Waiters glided between the guests with trays of appetizers. Eleanor shone in her couture dress, her famous pearl necklace sparkling in the light of the crystal chandeliers. Marcus glanced at his watch and nodded to Veronica. She took out her phone and made a quick call. A few minutes later, the manager of the city bank entered the hall, accompanied by 2 men in formal suits. They headed straight for Preston. He noticed them approaching, and a shadow of concern flashed across his face. He tried to pull Eleanor aside, but the banker was already standing next to him. "Mr. Fairchild," the manager said loudly enough for the nearest guest to hear, "allow me to congratulate you on your engagement, and at the same time discuss the results of the financial audit of your car dealerships." Preston turned pale. His hand holding the glass trembled noticeably. I don't think we should spoil the party with business talk. He tried to smile, but it came out crooked. On the contrary, the banker objected. Your future wife should know about the state of affairs, about the forged documents, the multi-million-dollar debts, and other interesting details. The room grew quiet. Guests turned toward them, drawn by the unusual scene. Eleanor looked confusedly from Preston to the banker. This is some kind of mistake, Preston muttered, backing toward the exit. A misunderstanding. No mistake, Marcus's voice rang out. He had come down into the hall and was now standing casually, leaning against the bar. Just like your previous marriage, and the one before that, and the one before that. Preston darted for the doors, but security guards blocked his way. His face was covered in spots. His tie was askew. Eleanor, dear, he whispered, don't believe them. It's a conspiracy. But the widow had already stepped away from him, mechanically clutching a pearl necklace in her hands. Her face expressed disgust. Marcus nodded to the waiter. He turned on the large screen on the wall, usually used for sports broadcasts. Documents appeared on the screen. Bank statements, certificates of previous marriages, court decisions. Interesting reading, Marcus commented, especially the story with the real estate in Miami. Or was that another widow? Preston rushed toward the exit, pushing guests aside. But two police officers blocked his way. Someone had called them. Mr. Fairchild, one of them said, you'll have to come with us. We have some questions about document fraud. Eleanor ripped the engagement ring off her finger and threw it at Preston's feet. He didn't even notice. He was too busy trying to break free from the police officers. Marcus watched the scene with a slight smile. Veronica handed him a folder with documents, evidence of financial fraud, proof of previous marriages, statements from the women he had deceived. Be more careful when choosing your victims next time, Marcus said quietly. If there is a next time, that is. Preston was led out through the service entrance. The hall was still filled with shocked silence. Eleanor sobbed on her friend's shoulder. The waiters stood frozen with their trays, not knowing what to do next. Marcus caught the banker's eye and nodded slightly. The job was done, beautifully, cleanly, without unnecessary fuss. Preston Fairchild would never deceive anyone again, at least not in this town. The guest wing was quiet, only the sound of a violin breaking the morning silence. Abigail was rehearsing a difficult passage, and her playing was becoming more and more confident. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting intricate patterns on the floor. Melody looked through the documents sent by her lawyer. After the scandal at the Azure Peacock, the divorce proceedings were going surprisingly smoothly. Preston, who was under investigation for financial fraud, did not contest a single point of the agreement. Abigail put down her violin and looked questioningly at her teacher. Lately, she had often stayed after class, as if she didn't want to go back to the main house. They could talk about music for hours or just sit in cozy silence, looking at the pink garden. There was a delicate knock at the door, and Veronica appeared with a tray of tea and fresh pastries. She placed a fresh newspaper on the table next to the documents, with a photo of Preston in handcuffs on the front page. Melody pushed the newspaper away. She didn't want to know the details. Father asked me to tell you that the lawyer is expecting you tomorrow at 10, Veronica said, setting out the cups. The car will be ready at 9:30. Abigail settled into a deep armchair, carefully holding her cup of tea. She had matured noticeably over the past few weeks, and there was a new grace in her movements. Perhaps it was the music. She had been practicing twice as hard in preparation for her conservatory audition. You know, she said suddenly, looking out the window, when you first started giving me lessons, my father said it was temporary. That music wasn't serious. But now... She fell silent, but Melody understood. Marcus Ravenscroft had changed. He increasingly lingered in the hall after his daughter's lessons, listening to her play. Sometimes he even commented on her interpretation of a particular piece. Aunt Agatha, who had returned from her trip around the world, often visited her niece in the guest cottage. She brought back many stories and souvenirs, but most importantly, she brought back a new, calm wisdom. "Everything is turning out exactly as it should," she would say, pouring tea into antique cups. "Sometimes you have to go through trials to find your place." Roses bloomed in the garden, Abigail's favorite flowers. Every morning the old gardener brought a fresh bouquet for the music room. Melody noticed that the girl often talked to him about flowers, coaxing secrets out of him about caring for the capricious plants. Marcus rarely appeared in the wing, but his presence was felt invisibly in everything, in the impeccable work of the staff, in the timely resolution of issues, in how quickly and smoothly the divorce proceedings were going. In the evenings, when Abigail finished her lessons, Melody often sat by the window listening to the birds singing in the garden. She thought about how strange life was. What had seemed like a disaster had turned out to be the beginning of something new. The lawyer informed them that all the documents were ready to be signed. Preston agreed to all the terms. Apparently, he had more serious problems than the divorce proceedings. The bank began debt collection proceedings, and his car dealerships closed one after another. Aunt Agatha looked through the documents and just grunted, "Marcus Ravenscroft knows how to get things done. I wonder how many more skeletons he found in your ex-husband's closet." Melody didn't ask. She was grateful for the support but preferred not to know the details. It was enough that the nightmare was over and she could start her life over again. Abigail gathered her violin and sheet music but was in no hurry to leave. She stood by the window, looking out at the pink garden as if she were about to say something. Finally, she made up her mind. "You're staying here, aren't you? Even when this is all over?" Melody came up to her and put her arms around her shoulders. Outside the window, the gardener was pruning the roses, preparing them for the new flowering season. Somewhere deep in the garden, birds were singing. Life went on, and it was beautiful in its simplicity. The idea of starting her own school came to her by chance. Parents began to visit the guest wing more and more often, asking her to give lessons to their children. Rumors of a talented teacher had spread throughout the town. Melody couldn't accept everyone who wanted to study with her, but she didn't want to turn anyone away. One evening, as she was looking through the latest list of students, Marcus came in to discuss Abigail's schedule. He glanced at the stack of applications on the table, and his eyes lit up with interest. "How many are there?" "More than 30, Melody sighed. "And the wing isn't made of rubber." Marcus paused, looking at the list, then said quietly, "There's a mansion for sale on Maple Street, an old house with good acoustics. It would make an excellent school." And so the work began. Marcus insisted that his architect personally oversee the redesign. The classrooms had to be bright with good acoustics. Melody watched the renovations, noting how the old house was gradually being transformed. The building seemed to be begging to become a music school. High ceilings, spacious rooms, a luxurious staircase with wrought iron banisters. Veronica was already working on the paperwork for the license, and Aunt Agatha promised to help with antique furniture. She knew special places in Europe where you could find real treasures. Abigail often came to the construction site with Melody. She wandered through the empty rooms, imagining where the pianos would stand and how the music would sound under the ancient arches. At such moments she became remarkably similar to her mother, whose portrait Melody had accidentally seen in Marcus's office. It happened a week ago. She brought some documents to be signed, more paperwork for school. Marcus was busy on the phone and motioned for her to wait. While he was talking, Melody looked around the office and suddenly noticed a photograph in a simple silver frame. A young woman with red hair and a violin in her hands. Marcus caught her glance. When he finished his conversation, he was silent for a moment, staring at the portrait. "She loved music too," he finally said. She played the violin in the city orchestra. We met at a Vivaldi concert. He fell silent, but Melody already understood why Abigail's mother was never mentioned in the house, why the girl never spoke of her. She had died in childbirth, leaving Marcus with a newborn daughter. Abigail looks a lot like her, he added quietly, especially when she plays. Something subtle changed after that conversation. Marcus began to show up at the construction site more often, making adjustments to the plans and discussing the details of the future school with Melody. His comments were always precise and businesslike, but there was something more to them than just concern for the investment. One day, he lingered after inspecting the work. They stood on the second floor, looking through the tall windows at the setting sun. "You know," Marcus said, without looking at Melody, "when Abigail started playing music, I was against it. I thought it would reopen old wounds, but now I see that music helps her feel closer to the mother she never knew." Melody said nothing. She understood how much it cost this reserved man to make such a confession. Life had also changed in the guest wing. Now the three of them often had dinner together: Melody, Abigail, and Marcus. They talked about music, about Abigail's future school, about her upcoming audition for the conservatory. The girl seemed to blossom before their eyes. Her playing became more mature and confident. Marcus listened to his daughter with a new expression on his face, as if he were rediscovering the features of the woman he loved. Sometimes Melody caught his thoughtful gaze, but he quickly looked away, returning to his businesslike tone. The school was scheduled to open at the beginning of the school year. Melody had already selected several teachers, talented musicians who shared her approach to teaching. Abigail participated in the interviews with an air of importance, listening carefully to each candidate. "You're creating something special," Marcus said one day as he looked over the list of prospective students. "Not just a school, a place where children can find themselves through music." His words lacked his usual reserve, only understanding and a new, as yet undefined feeling. Melody caught herself thinking that she liked this new tone in his voice. They worked together more and more often, discussing plans and organizational issues. Marcus proved to be an attentive listener and a wise advisor. His business acumen was surprisingly combined with an unexpectedly subtle understanding of art. One Saturday, he invited Melody and Abigail to a concert at the Philharmonic. They played Vivaldi, Abigail's mother's favorite composer. The girl sat between her father and her teacher, holding their hands tightly. During the intermission, Marcus bought a bouquet of white roses, the same ones that grew in his garden. The future seemed bright and full of hope: a new school, Abigail's success, and the strange, slowly growing feeling of mutual respect and trust between two people who had learned to appreciate the present. The summer flew by in a flurry of activity and worries. The school gradually came to life. Pianos and music stands appeared in the classrooms, portraits of composers adorned the walls, and an antique clock brought back by Aunt Agatha from one of her travels was installed in the hall. Teachers settled into their offices, developed programs, and the first timid scales and etudes could already be heard in the corridors. Abigail helped with auditions for new students. She sat next to Melody with an important look on her face, making notes in her notebook. Her own studies continued. She was preparing to enter the conservatory and was to perform as a soloist at the school's opening ceremony. Marcus showed up almost every day, sometimes with documents, sometimes with new ideas for organizing the space. His business acumen was surprisingly combined with an unexpectedly subtle understanding of music. They spent a lot of time discussing plans for the school's development, and these conversations increasingly went beyond purely business relations. One evening, when the last students had left and they were alone in the school, Marcus suddenly said, "You know, I think we should join forces, not just in matters concerning the school." Melody looked up from her folder of documents. The office was quiet. Only the ticking of an old clock marked the passing seconds. "You're a business person," Marcus continued, looking out the window. "And I'm a business person. We both know the value of a partnership based on mutual respect and common goals." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "Abigail needs a mother. The school needs a reliable financial partner. And you and I, we could create something more than just a business venture." It sounded like a business proposal, but there was something else in his voice, a warmth he couldn't or wouldn't hide. Melody was silent, staring at the bouquet of white roses the gardener brought to her office every morning. She thought of the quiet evenings in the guest wing, of their dinners together, of how Marcus listened to his daughter play, of the thoughtful look on his face when he looked at them both. "I'm not suggesting a romantic relationship," he added more quietly. "We're both too old for that, but we could build something real, together." In the classroom above, someone was playing Chopin. The melody seeped through the old floors, creating a background that was surprisingly appropriate for the moment. 2 weeks later, guests gathered in the main hall of the new music school. Antique chandeliers flooded the space with soft light, and the September sunset was fading in the tall windows. Musicians were tuning their instruments on stage, the first big concert at the newly opened school. Abigail stood backstage in a white concert dress, nervously clutching her violin. Melody adjusted a stray strand of hair from her hairstyle. "Are you ready?" The girl nodded, then suddenly hugged her teacher impulsively. "I'm so glad you'll always be with us now." The spotlight reflected off the simple gold ring on Melody's hand. Marcus had insisted on rings, no diamonds, nothing ostentatious, just a symbol of partnership and trust. He waited for them in the front row, dressed in a formal suit, his gaze attentive, a slight smile intended only for the two of them. Aunt Agatha sat next to him, having returned from another trip especially for the school opening. When Abigail came on stage, the hall fell silent. Her violin began to sing, telling a story of music, love, loss, and discovery. Melody looked at the snow falling outside the window and thought about the strangeness of fate, which sometimes takes something away to give something more valuable in return. Not bright passion, but deep understanding. Not fairy tale love, but a reliable partnership. Not someone else's luxurious home, but her own real work. Marcus turned to her, and she saw the same understanding in his eyes. They both knew the value of what they were starting to build together.